You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we have some major news here. We have newly released audio from an interview that Trump did with John Karl, where he makes some damning admissions, not least of which is Trump saying, quote, the people that went to Washington that day went because they thought the election was rigged. But Glenn, we have an avalanche of evidence that Trump's lawyers all told him the election wasn't rigged, that he simply lost. So is Trump not just admitting that they all went to the Capitol on the basis of his willful lies?
Yeah, so the prosecutors are probably salivating anew because they've just received another batch of incriminating statements right out of the orange horse's mouth. I mean, Donald Trump at some point might want to stop because he's providing so much ammunition to Jack Smith, Fani Willis, and their respective teams of prosecutors. You know, when he admits that people went to the Capitol that day because they thought the election was rigged, that's basically a tribute to Donald Trump's lies. It really serves to prove the success of his relentless disinformation campaign. I mean, he worked long and hard to deceive the American voters. You know, it was like his mantra. The election was rigged. Your vote was stolen. Your favorite president is being taken away from you. And if you don't fight like hell, you won't have a country anymore. Now go to the Capitol and stop the certification. Of course, he said, stop the steal. Same thing. So, you know, this is another piece of damning evidence that Jack Smith will be able to introduce against Donald Trump at trial. And it really will boil down to, you know, what are the most compelling incriminating statements from Donald Trump? Because at some point, enough is enough. And one thing that you don't want to do is over-try your case, you know, go on too long, try the jury's patience, because, you know, Donald Trump has provided so much incriminating information that once this case moves into court proper, it's going to be like shooting fish in a barrel.
Well, you know, just days ago, testimony from Sidney Powell's proffer session leaked, and in it, she says that Donald Trump was told, and this is firsthand evidence, that Donald Trump was told that he lost the election by White House counsel. So how does evidence like that impact statements like this one that Trump just made, that the insurrectionists were only there because they believed the election was rigged?
Yeah, it makes it all the more incriminating because there will be a chorus of Republican voices, Republican witnesses just streaming through the courtroom when Donald Trump is on trial in Washington, D.C., saying White House counsel, deputy White House counsel, the attorney general. These are people that Donald Trump brought into his inner circle to give him the very advice they were giving him, saying over and over again, the election wasn't rigged, the election wasn't stolen. But Donald Trump discarded all that because it didn't suit his interests, and he continued to lie to the American people. So when you have Sidney Powell, who, you know, reluctant cooperating witness though she may be, she's going to come in and testify, I was in the room. I heard Pat Cipollone tell Donald Trump the election wasn't stolen, and yet Donald Trump goes out on the morning of January 6th at his pre-insurrection pep rally and continues to lie. And those lies were knowing, right? They were intentional. They were calculated to stop the certification of Joe Biden's win. So again, the incriminating evidence just continues to mount against Donald Trump.
He also acknowledges that he could have, quote, stopped the problem and that he would have been, quote, well received. Glenn, when you admit that you had the power to stop an ongoing insurrection, does that not confer some responsibility onto you for its continuation?
You know, Brian, that is the most sharply incriminating statement in that whole interview that was just recently revealed. Because recall some of the evidence that we saw during the January 6th House Select Committee public hearings. There were witnesses who said, while the Capitol attack raged on, Donald Trump was in a little private dining room right off the Oval Office, and people were streaming through, telling him, please, Mr. President, call off the attack. And by all accounts, he refused to do it. I remember one witness distinctly saying, we sent Ivanka back in twice to try to convince her father to call off the attack because Ivanka seemed to have some of the most sway with her father, and even she couldn't convince him to call off the attack. And what does he now say, right? Out of his own mouth, he said, oh, I was going to go down there and stop it. He's acknowledging that he could have stopped the attack on the U.S. Capitol. Why? He was the one who launched it. He could have called it off. So the evidence that, person after person after person begged him to stop the attack and he wouldn't, he has now announced in that interview, I had the power to stop what he calls the problem, and I didn't.
We're seeing these 14th Amendment cases, which are cases related to the disqualification of someone for running for president if they engage in or aid those who've engaged in an insurrection. Judges are now being faced with the question of Trump rendering himself ineligible for inciting an insurrection. Could this tape play into those cases?
Absolutely. There was a trial held in Colorado in state court, and we are awaiting the result. We're going to see if Judge Sarah Wallace rules, finds, concludes that Donald Trump obviously engaged in an insurrection and gave aid and comfort to insurrectionists. Therefore, he is constitutionally disqualified from holding public office in the future. We're waiting for that result now. But these kind of statements, these statements could easily have been played at that trial, the Colorado trial. The evidence has now concluded, and we're just waiting for the judge's decision. But this is one of many trials that are going to unfold, I think, on a rolling basis. I believe some states are probably waiting to see the result of the Colorado case and whether the judge rules that he's disqualified. But I do think the disqualification ball is going to gain momentum. And this kind of evidence, these kind of admissions, deeply incriminating admissions out of Donald Trump's own mouth, are gold to the people who are trying to prove to a judge's satisfaction that, yeah, Donald Trump engaged in insurrection.
Just a quick process question here. We're going to have these cases like the one happening in Colorado, and presumably we're going to have other cases in states across the country. Does it really not matter to have cases in other states, considering the Colorado one is either going to be appealed by the left or the right, depending on who wins, and that one's going to end up going to the Supreme Court, and like the other ones are going to be moot because this is all going to be rolled into one federal issue anyway?
Yes and no. It will be an important indication if the Colorado judge rules that he's disqualified. It makes its way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court then has to decide that issue. But the reason it will be important to continue these cases in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, because each evidentiary record that is established during the course of each state court trial will be different. And, we don't know what the Supreme Court will do. I have a feeling they're not enthusiastic about doing anything that would install an aspiring dictator back into the Oval Office. But they will decide every case based on the factual record that was developed in the trial court. And not each one of these trials will unfold the same. So it is actually important to keep these things rolling through the state courts and, present as much evidence from as many witnesses and as many sources and as many constitutional experts as the state can gather together. And each record of trial will be different. Now, yes, once the Supreme Court announces a principle, other states, the results in other states may become less important. But no, I think these cases need to continue to roll through the state courts.
Okay, and obviously interviews like the one that we just saw between Trump and John Karl will present themselves in these cases as they continue to progress. So as we see more cases, we'll obviously stay on top of them. For those watching, if you want to cover these cases as we do, make sure to subscribe. The links are right here on this screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.